Welcome. I'm very happy to be sharing with you news about the new Brown Executive Functions / Attention Scales that we expect to be able to release in December 2018. And these are improved versions of scales that were published earlier. Some of you are probably familiar with the scales, the Brown scales that came out for ADHD in 1996 for adolescents and for adults. And then in 2001, we brought out the scales for children from 3 years old up to adolescents. These are completely new scales that are based upon an updated model of ADHD as impaired executive function. And I'd like to tell you about it. I hope you'll find it interesting, and I think you'll find that these scales provide a more effective tool for getting the full range of impairments that are associated with ADHD. Because I'm sure you understand, there's been a big change in the way we think about ADHD over the past decade. For a long time, this disorder, which was originally written up in the medical literature in 1902, was thought about simply as a problem with hyperactivity. And what's happened since then is that there have been some important changes made in understanding the disorder. The old model was very much focused upon disruptive behavior. The little kids who couldn't sit still, wouldn't shut up, and were driving everybody nuts at home and in the classroom. And what's increasingly emerged over the last 10 to 15 years is a recognition that this disorder is really much more complicated, and that it is often not involved with problems of behavior. Many times it is, but there are some kids who have ADHD and some adolescents and adults who have ADHD who've never had any significant behavior problems, where their difficulties are much more in the range of executive functions that pertain primarily to attention. More about that in just a couple of minutes. When we're talking about executive functions, there are a number of different descriptions of that term and definitions of the term in the literature, but basically what we're talking about is a wide range of very central control processes of the brain that serve to connect and to prioritize and to integrate cognitive functions for us moment by moment. And the metaphor that I often use for thinking about this is if you picture a symphony orchestra where all the musicians are really very good at playing their instruments. Regardless of how good they may be, if you don't have a conductor who can select what they're going to play and get each one to play his or her specific part in the same piece at the same time and keep the whole orchestra on time, without a good conductor, you're not going to get very good music out of a symphony. And the problems involved in executive functions when they're impaired are not comparable to impairments in one specific part of the brain. They're involved in those neural networks that function as the conductors of the brain's symphony. Muriel Lisak, whom most of you would know from her pioneering work on neuropsychological assessment, once spoke about it and said, you know, the executive functions are those which deal with the question, will you do it? And if so, how are you going to do it? And when are you going to do it? Now, if you take this apart, you realize that what we're looking at are issues that have to do with motivation and with activation, being able to get started on things. How will you do it? Addresses issues of planning and organizing and prioritizing. And when are you going to get around to it? The timing, being able to estimate when it needs to be done and how to do it. And then very much involved in that, of course, is working memory of being able to keep track of what you intend to do and what you just finished. Now, when you begin to think about those functions, one of the things that's very clear for all of us who have worked with individuals who are kids when they're little and adolescents and with adults is that these capacities, these executive function capacities, develop through childhood into adolescence and beyond. They're not fully present at all in early childhood. And we know this in terms of the way the curriculum for a school is designed and the way that we as parents bring up our kids. You expect different things of kids as they get older. and you sort of expect some difficulties that they're not being able to manage this task or that task when they're 5 or 6, but then when they're 6 or 7, you expect, well, it should be coming along, and moving it up from the point of learning how to cross the street safely or going up and down the stairs safely without somebody holding their hand to eventually getting into the things that are scarier for parents, like watching their kids learn how to drive the car. So we've got these environmental demands that increase with age, and those are basically established on the basis of what daily life is in terms of what you can see a child being able to do. Actually, executive functions are among the last aspects of the brain to develop, and for most people, they are not actually fully matured until at least like 18, 19, 20 or beyond. And the DSM speaks about how executive function, the ADHD symptoms are supposed to be manifest in some ways, at least by age 12. It used to be 7, now it's 12. But the fact is, we're talking about a wider range of problems now that include many things that are not included in the DSM-5. And sometimes you can see it, often you can see it by age 12, but sometimes it doesn't, particularly with really bright kids. You often do not see it until they get a little bit older, adolescents and late adolescence. Now, I'd like to share with you a model. Some of you may have read some of the things I've written about this or heard me talk before, and I hope you won't be bored, because I'd like to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about the model that I've developed for talking about executive functions. This is one that I undergirded the scales that were published earlier. The scales that came out in '96 for adolescents and adults included only the first 5 of these categories. That was because at the time we started out trying to identify problems of inattention in people who were not hyper, and then we learned that by researching and testing it that exactly the same problems were characteristic of the people who had the behavioral problems as well. And so starting with the scales that I published in 2001, we've used this 6-cluster model. Let me make a couple of general comments about it, and then I'll talk just to give a few specific examples of what sort of things each of these includes. The first thing is to say that the little boxes at the bottom, activation, focus, effort, emotion, memory, and action, those are not labels for unitary variables. It's not as though we're talking about something like height or weight or blood pressure, which is all one thing and you just have more or less of it. Rather, you might think about these categories as simply baskets of related cognitive functions. And as you look at them, and we'll talk about each of them a little more separately, what you realize is that these things operate dynamically. That most of the tasks that we do that involve executive function, where we don't have someone else walking us through it and saying, okay, now do this, now do that, but where we have to be able to have an idea of what we're trying to do and how to do it, involve dynamic interaction between these various functions. And they're not all localized in one part of the brain. This is a very dynamic process that involves many networks in the brain. And the third thing to know about it is that these are operating mostly unconsciously. Now, I'm not talking about unconscious in the sense of repression in the psychoanalytic literature. No, I'm talking about the more modern notion of automaticity, that they happen so fast that you don't stop to think about them. They're integrated in the way that you have to do when you're trying to drive your car, or when you're typing up an email, or when you're carrying on a conversation, where there may be some things that come up that you have to deliberately think about, but many of these functions are operating automatically without conscious control. So let's take a look at what this is referring to. I'm not going to go over all components of it, but just give you an idea of what each of these different clusters is referring to. I'll have a few more detailed examples later. But the organize, prioritize, and activate has to do with being able to get started on tasks and to organize and prioritize to be able to do that. And I think all of us who work in this field know that some of the kids that we see and some of the adolescents and adults that we see have a lot of difficulty organizing their stuff, their backpacks, their desks, their living space, unless somebody else is helping them take care of it. Others don't have much trouble at all organizing their stuff, but they have a lot of trouble organizing their time and their work and figuring out, okay, how long is it going to take to do this job or that job? And to be able then, critically, to get started on it. The third bullet there is talking about the problems involved in procrastination, which is one of the central difficulties of a lot of folks with ADHD. That they have an idea of, yeah, I'm going to do that, but they have a lot of trouble getting themselves started often until the very last minute, where they feel like they have a gun to their head and that if they don't take care of this right now, it's going to be a big problem. But it's this cluster of functions of being able to organize and, not just stuff, but also time, which involves figuring out how long is this going to take and which things should be first, second, and third, and then actually getting started. Those are the things that are typical of this particular cluster of cognitive functions that we call executive. But let's go on, because rarely do these things operate alone. This talks about focus. And sometimes people get the notion of this as focus as sort of locking in on something and neglect the fact that you also have to be able to shift your focus and sustain attention to tasks. And that we certainly know that a lot of the people that we see who have ADHD have difficulties holding focus and staying on a task. But it's also true that many of them get stuck on a task and have a difficult time transitioning to one thing or another. Often they're easily distracted, and you'll find that they sometimes are being distracted by other noises in a classroom, for example, somebody talking out in the hall or looking out the window. And other times the distractions come internally, just other thoughts that they have as they are going on. And one thing that I'd like to emphasize, although it's not on the slide, is all of the characteristics that I'm going to be talking about here as characteristics of ADHD and impaired executive function are problems all of us have sometimes. It's just that there are some people who have a lot more difficulty with it than others. So when we're thinking about this, we've always got to compare how is this individual at this age, at this particular point in his or her life, functioning on these things compared to other people in the same age group. But let me mention about the third bullet here, something that I think of as very important in this particular set of rating scales. And it was included in the earlier scales that we published, but it's now even more explicit in these, and that is the situational variability of the symptoms. And let me just give you one example here. We're going to talk more about that in a few minutes, and that is in reading. If you ask someone, do you have difficulty when you're reading, where you can keeping track of things and then remembering what you've read? If you don't stipulate whether you're talking about reading something they're really interested in or something that's just been assigned where they don't particularly feel interested in it, you may not get a very adequate answer. Because most of the patients I've seen, and there are quite a few of them, little kids, teenagers, and adults, will tell me that when I'm reading something that is really interesting to me because it's my hobby, the skier who's reading about skiing, the person who's really interested in cars reading about cars, be able to get into some activity that I'm interested, something that's related to something I'm really interested in, I don't have any trouble focusing at all. But if it's something where I'm not that interested in, it's a sign, yes, I've got to do it. What happens then is sometimes, often what they'll tell you is that I'll read it, a few sentences or a few paragraphs, and then I'll read on, then stop for a minute and realize my eyes have gone over every word, and I understood it at the time I read it, but now it doesn't stick in my head. It's like I haven't got the foggiest notion of what it's about. One college student I saw one time describe this, and he said, when I'm reading something that's not all that interesting to me, It's as though my mind is licking the words and not chewing them. I think you can see what he's talking about. And the point here is that in these scales, we try to address the situational variability. For example, reading something you're interested in is very different for people with ADHD compared to people who don't have ADHD. And when these people are reading stuff that they're not that interested in, then you really see the impairment in terms of working memory. But this includes many other things as well. We've got items here that are assessing for difficulty in being able to get to sleep, difficulty in being able to wake up, difficulty in being able to sustain alertness during the day. We're talking about something which was picked up in a kid I saw at university one time who was on the track team, runner, and he said, you know, my mind's a great sprinter, but it's a lousy distance runner. If the task I'm trying to do is something you do quickly in one chunk, you just go all out for it and you're done with it, I'm fine. But if it's something where you can't do it in one quick chunk, it's a longer-term project. You have to keep chipping away at it day after day. That I have a lot more trouble with. And my approach then is either hurry up, slapdash, get the damn thing done. Let's not worry too much about quality control. Or why don't you set this aside and wait until it becomes more of an emergency. And the third bullet here is something that I think is important, and that is the whole issue of processing speed. Those of you who are psychologists certainly know that those tests that we use on the Wechsler IQ for coding and symbol search often pick up chronic difficulties that are in themselves. You look at it and say, well, how often do you have to do this? Not often, but the fact is those are a way of checking into processing speed, which often is correlated with a person's ability to copy things off the board or to write out answers to the questions and just to process the information they've got. And it's important, again, to look at that in terms of the specific situations. But processing speed is a really important domain. Now, the DSM-5 criteria do not include anything about emotion, the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. However, those of us who do research in this find that's a very important part of the difficulties that are faced by children and adults with ADHD. And so you will find on these new scales something which was included in the earlier version. We've tried to make it a little more specific and a little more clear that when people find that their frustration or their worries or their irritation or their discouragement just sort of gobbles up all the space in their head and it's very hard for them to be able to focus, that's an important part of executive function, is being able to put the lid on that, to be able to put it to the back of one's mind and move on. And so what we're tapping for here is not a full range of emotional disorders, but rather the daily issues involved in being able to do what you need to do without having emotions get too much in the way. And there are a number of items on these scales that are going to be coming out that pick up on that. Working memory, one of the most important aspects of ADHD. And this, of course, is referring to difficulty in being able to hold one or several things online while paying attention to other tasks. It also picks up on prospective memory, being able to remember what you're supposed to remember. And it's also the working memory is the search engine for the brain, to be able to pull out of memory storage the information that's needed for the test you're taking or the conversation that you're having. The sixth cluster, it's not just hyperactivity and impulsive behavior. It's dealing with the broader question of difficulty in controlling action, slowing oneself down when you need to slow down and speeding up when you need to speed up for whatever tasks you're doing. There are many people we see with ADHD who feel like the prize is always going to go to the person who finishes first on the test, even though it means that they're often going through so quickly, don't read the question carefully, and don't really address the issues that they're being asked to address. It also has to do with social functions and be able to size up ongoing situations carefully And people with ADHD often find it's hard to monitor and modify their own actions to fit the situation. Again, context is important. So these are the 6 clusters in the model that I've been working with. And I'd emphasize again, these are dimensional. It's not all or nothing. All of these are problems all of us have sometimes. It's just for those who warrant the diagnosis of ADHD, these are pretty chronic and severe impairments, and they tend to be a cluster. But far more important, I think, in understanding ADHD, because it's puzzling to most people, is the situational variability of the symptoms. You know, I've seen thousands of children and adults with ADHD, and every one of them has a few activities in which they have absolutely no difficulty in exercising these executive functions, even though they have a lot of difficulty most of the rest of the time for most anything else they're trying to do. And the problem this creates is that it makes ADHD look like it's a problem with willpower, when in fact it's not. And one of the things I've written about in several of the books I've done and papers I've done is this question about the situational variability of the symptoms. I speak about this as the central mystery of ADHD. Why is it that those who have ADHD can focus for this but not for that and that and that? And this is the sort of thing where typically you ask them, you know, well, if you can focus so well on playing soccer, or you can focus so well on playing your guitar, or so well on building your Lego constructions, how come you can't function on what we're doing in class? And then, of course, the other side of it is, you know, why focus late at the last minute when, in fact, you could focus now and get things done? And typically, if you ask the first question, you know, why is it you can do it for this but not for that? Typically, the person will say, as I suggested earlier, if it's something I'm really interested in, then I can focus on it. And most people hear that and say, yeah, right, congratulations, that's true for anybody. Anybody's going to focus better on something they're really interested in than for something they're not, which is true. And the other thing is that, you know, why don't you get to these things earlier? And what they'll tell you is, I'm a person who works better under stress. But what they're really talking about is getting themselves mobilized to be able to do it. And the question is, why is motivation in ADHD so variable in one situation for those with ADHD than for others? It's variable for all of us in one situation to another, but those with ADHD have much more difficulty in being able to mobilize their executive functions unless it's something that's really interesting to them. And there are 2 operating hypotheses about this central mystery of ADHD. Many people say it's just a problem with willpower. You know, you can do it here if you really want to, you could do it there. What's the matter with you? However, I had a patient years ago who taught me with this example. And he said, you know, having ADHD is like having erectile dysfunction of the mind. If the task you're trying to do is something that really interests you, if it really turns you on, you're up for it and you can perform. But if the task you're trying to do is not something that's intrinsically interesting, if it doesn't turn you on, you can't get it up. And if you can't get it up, you're not going to be able to perform. And in that situation, it doesn't matter how much you may say to yourself, I need to, I really ought to, I should. You can't make it happen. It's simply not a willpower kind of thing. And I think that that particular analogy, focused even as it is simply on male functioning, is true for people with ADHD generally, that very often if they do not have interest in something, they have enormous difficulty. Unless they feel they've got a gun to their head and something that they think of as very unpleasant is going to happen fast if they don't take care of this right here, right now. Or there is something about it that really interests them. You know, it may not be logical at all, but just for whatever reasons it does interest them. That's the central mystery of ADHD. And it's not a problem with willpower, it's a problem with the dynamics of the chemistry of the brain. I've written about that more elsewhere. That's not the purpose of the focus of this talk. But the question that we're thinking about here is, you know, how do we go about noticing these problems with ADHD? And it varies. There are some kids where you can see in preschool years, this kid is really different from most other 4-year-olds or most other 3 or 5-year-olds. That they are much less able to control themselves. They need a lot more adult intervention. They pose more safety risks. There are some cases where you can really see it early. Some mothers will say, this kid, I've had 3 kids, and this one was really different even from in the womb. But there are many others where you don't see it that early. Sometimes you see it when they move from kindergarten into 1st grade. They've got to sit still a lot more. Sometimes not until middle elementary or middle school even, particularly when they make that move from having one teacher most of the day to having several teachers. They've got to move between, and they've got different classroom settings, different sets of rules, different materials, and so forth. And that's a time when you begin to see a lot of the students with ADHD, even those who are really bright. Because there are many kids who get through elementary school, among the high IQ population that I've specialized in, where they manage quite well in elementary school. You begin to see a little shakiness and a little fraying at the edges in middle school. And then they get into high school where they've got so many different teachers and the demands are markedly increased. Then you begin to see the ADHD, which may not have been noticeable for at all. And there's some where the parents are so successful in building scaffolding around their kids that you don't even see it until they move away from home. They're going off to college or something else. Then what you end up with is a situation where they may crash and burn because they've been too dependent upon too much reminding, too much structuring, and you realize that they just haven't been able to do it themselves. And what I'm suggesting here is that most of the tasks that require executive function, of course not everything we do requires that, require integrated use of multiple functions, usually without conscious deliberations as we do when we're driving our car. You have to be very conscious. You shift the focus from one thing to another. And what I propose to you is that they're measured not adequately with neuropsychological tests, but rather with clinical assessment of functioning in daily life in a variety of situations. Russell Barkley and I have both written about this, and the neuropsychological tests that are labeled as tests of executive function were not developed really to assess ADHD. They were developed to assess a variety, particularly of frontal lobe problems, and they can be very useful for assessing TBIs and strokes and a variety of other impairments of the central nervous system, but they are not sensitive enough to things that go on in daily life. You know, and it's really important, I think, to recognize the importance of getting details about how this individual focuses in their schooling or in their family or in their social relationships over time. You know, we're not looking at anything that we're going to be able to measure adequately, even with some of these computerized programs that claim to be able to measure executive function. So what are we going to do? Back in the day when ADHD was seen as a disruptive behavior disorder and nothing much more, the school janitor could make the diagnosis, as they knew which kids were getting sent out to sit in the hall or which ones would not come in for recess. But this sort of complex, everyday self-management that we're talking about now, to really assess this, you need 2 major things. One is self and collateral report on the performance of those complex, everyday, self-managed tasks. And how do you get that? You get it from clinical interviews and from normed rating scales. Those are more sensitive diagnostic indicators of executive function than any observation. You can't always see it in the classroom. If you're going in and sit there and watch the student in class, you may see a few things about behavior, but many of the people with ADHD, there's no observable differences. They can tell you where their head is when they're old enough to be able to talk with you about it, and that often they're looking forward like they're paying attention, but the fact is their mind's 1,000 miles away. And as I said, not from the neuropsych tests, so-called, of executive function. We need to get more details about day-to-day operations. And we need to get it from the self-report for kids old enough to talk with us about it, and also from parent report, but also from teacher report. Now, these new scales that we have, they're very similar to the ones that came out earlier, but they now have been refined, and there are new items that have been added, and we've improved on some of the old items. And we've got fully updated norms for ages 3 through adults. And those norms are gender specific and also you can get them combined. There's some new and updated test items that improve the clarity and the clinical relevance. They're based on the model we just talked about. We've added now something we did not have for the earlier adolescent form. That is a separate parent form available for adolescents. The norms are gender specific and combined gender for all the age groups. And it includes DSM-5 symptoms, but it is not limited to the DSM-5 symptoms. These are measures of executive function, and the DSM-5 has not caught up with the science about executive function. And so this incorporates the ADHD diagnostic criteria for ADHD in the DSM-5, but it also picks up a lot of other concerns that are important related to executive function that don't currently appear in the DSM-5. And we can administer them with the Q Global web-based system. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So what's so different about these scales? I realize there are a number of other scales out there, but let me tell you what I think are some of the unique features of these. One is that the situational variability of the symptoms. Many of the rating scales that are out there for executive function and for ADHD now do not address the issue of the situational variability of the symptoms. The fact that those people who have ADHD, kids or adults, often can focus very well on a few specific activities or tasks which really hold strong interest for them, but have a lot more difficulty, even when they're trying, to focus on other tasks that are not all that interesting to them, even when they know that those are important. And these scales include a number of items that ask about difficulties encountered in specific contexts. For example, what I spoke about before, difficulty remembering what you've just been read when it's assigned and not all that interesting to you versus reading that you've chosen because you really like it. And there's a multiple perspective assessment. There's some things that teachers can tell us that parents can't tell us. There's some things parents can tell us that the teachers don't see. And there's some things that the student can see and tell us if you ask the right questions and listen carefully that you're not going to be able to get from the parent or the teacher. Obviously, it gets a little bit easier as they get a little bit older, but we've got, the self-report scales start at age 8 for these scales. And by the time they get to 8, if you ask the right questions and listen carefully, you can get quite a bit of information from the child as well as information that's important from the parents and the teachers. Another thing that we've done in these new scales is to focus on severity rather than frequency. A number of the existing scales for executive function basically ask the question of how often does this function happen? How often do you have this problem? And that, I think, doesn't always capture it because there's some things that people may do frequently that aren't that big a deal. And there's some other things that they may not happen very often, but when they do happen, it makes a lot of trouble for them. And so what we've tried to do is to discriminate between things that are small problem, medium problem, big problem. And with just a little bit of interpretation, I think you can use that to get even young children to tell you something that's far more important than trying to answer a question about how often does a symptom happen, because those things are so situationally variable. Does it happen in school but not at home? Or does it happen when you're with your friends? And so that the issue of sort of trying to get the geography straight is very hard to pick up if all you're asking about is frequency. What you want to know is how big a problem is this for the person, regardless of where it's happening. And as I already mentioned, it does include the DSM-5 things, but also more. And that more is important because the impairments of executive function, which can be so crippling to a lot of students, are not all picked up in the DSM criteria. Those have not been really refined on the basis of empirical research for many years. And there's a lot involved in executive function that the DSM-5 does not pick up, and it does not use that language. And they are based on this other model, which I've developed, which is consistent with what's been done in much of the other research on executive function. These are the forms we have available. For 3 to 7-year-olds, we've got a parent form and a teacher form. Each perspective is going to be a little bit different. It's important. At 8 is where we begin with self-report forms. And there we're looking at self-report, parent, and teacher report. And then for 13 to 18-year-olds, we ask for self-report, and then we have this new form for parent report. We used to be able to take parent report with the self-report, but it wasn't being scored separately. And now we've got this separate form so that you can get a self-report done. And then we have the self-report form for 19 and up, and that form can also be utilized by any other collateral. You just basically ignore the pronouns in it, and you can have, spouses or parents or others report on to what extent these things are a problem. And there are many people who prefer to send the forms out early and have them filled out at home in order to be able to utilize the time more effectively, the limited time for an evaluation. And then you can review them when they get there. It's always important to check and try and see if you can get clearly what the person understood the question to be asking, and perhaps pick up on a misinterpretation. And then others administer this orally. That's my preference if I'm in a situation where I've got time to do it that way. But I realize there are differences in what setting you're working in and whether you actually have time to do it all. And sometimes you do really need to ask to have it prepared ahead of time and then review it with them. And at the risk of being repetitious here, I'd just like to say it's not just with reading, but also when you're writing or talking. And when are you fidgety when you have to wait? It's one thing when you're fidgety sitting in the classroom all day. It's quite another thing when you're standing in line getting ready to go someplace, or a situation where it's a long time and you're being asked to sit still in a family dinner that's going on interminably. And then also on issues like we've got an item that relates to it's hard for me to stop doing things I like to do, even when I know I should. There are a variety of ways in which this situational variability is central to issues about ADHD. And these are the dimensions I mentioned. That we're not asking how often, we're asking how big a deal, how big a problem is it? No problem, little problem, medium problem, big problem. And I think that you'll find that framework is one which will allow you to capture more adequately these behaviors, some of which vary considerably from one situation to another. How can you use them? The scoring and report system, there are 3 ways to do it. There's Q Global, where you can do a web-based administration for this, administering it and scoring it and getting the reports using the Q Global platform. And you can quickly put the information together, generate the scores, and produce reports that can be taken home all via the web. And then you've got the paper administration, where you can send the forms home and have them brought back in and then punch them into your computer and get it quickly, the data assessment, and then generate the reports, which should be helpful to you for being able to have a report to give to the patient, to the parents, and to other clinicians who are involved. And then if you don't want to do it on the computer, they certainly can be done with the paper administration. Use the form and set up so that you can score them yourself with the answer sheets and scoring rules that are provided in the manual. Now, what we've got here next are, these are just, let me emphasize that I'm going to run through the 6 clusters again rather quickly. And I want to emphasize this bottom paragraph that these scales, these new scales, use the 6 clusters to provide a profile of this individual's functioning relative to these age-based and gender-based norms. And so the way the items are phrased in what we're about to look at is going to vary depending on what the age group is that we're assessing. And these are not the actual items that we have on the scale. These are taken from some of the earlier forms we had, and you'll find very similar things, but with modifications and some other things that are not here yet. Feeling overwhelmed when tasks are presented to them, having a hard time setting priorities, what should be first, second, and third, procrastinating too much, have a lot of trouble getting organized, whether it's packing the backpack or deciding what homework to do tonight and what to put off. Slow to get started. Being too rigid, too perfectionistic, where it takes you half a forever to get something simple done. Hard to wake up in the morning as part of activation. Misunderstanding directions. These are all a variety of things that are picked up. Focus, spacing out when reading, getting sidetracked easily. I think it's important, for example, especially with reading, and also with writing and doing math, it's not just listening when the teacher's talking. It's can you keep your head on what you're trying to do when you've got to read or when you've got to do some writing. Losing track when you're reading and have to go back many times, particularly in things that are not interesting, but sometimes even things that are. Those who have ADHD have to go, they'll read it once and they've got to go back and read it again and read it again. They understand the words, but it's difficult for them to engage their mind to put it into working memory. Trying to pay attention and mind drifts, difficulty getting the main idea in reading, getting lost in daydreaming, distracted easily, stares off into space, seems kind of out of it. Seems to be listening, but then gets complaints from people who say, it sure is not looking like you're listening very well. Effort, sustaining effort is one part, but this is also sleepy during the day. Needing extra time to complete tasks. There are some kids with ADHD where you have that slow processing speed, and they desperately need extended time to be able to complete tasks. There's others where it's on the opposite extreme, and they're rushing through too much, and they don't need extra time. They need some help in slowing down. Being criticized as lazy, which is often what happens with these kids, where adults parents and teachers will see that the kid can do very well and is very energetic and very focused on a few things they like to do, and you get disgusted with them and say, what is this? You could do it here. Why can't you do it there? Inconsistency in the quality of work. There's a variable in anybody's work, but those with ADHD often are conspicuously inconsistent. Not working to potential. Starts out with effort, looking pretty good, and then it just sort of fades quickly. They start out sprinting and end up jogging or walking. Sloppy, hard to read handwriting, where you're not able to keep focused on the task of writing enough to keep it legible. Needing a lot of reminders for tasks and to sustain the effort and just not finishing tasks. You notice many of these things are going to overlap from one cluster to another, which is why we're not only reporting cluster scores, we're also reporting integrated scores. Emotion, excessive impatience, hypersensitivity to criticism, easily irritated, short-fused, difficulty expressing anger, depressed mood, quick to give up on things, tending to be a loner among peers, or just coming across as though they just don't give a damn. Memory, obviously excessively forgetful, but also things like intending to do something and just forget about what it was they planned to do or what they were just asked to do. Has to make repeated restarts in writing. It's like they can't keep in mind what it is they were trying to write in order to get the sentences out on the page. Misplaces words or sticks in words or letters in writing that don't belong there. Loses track of stuff and certainly has difficulty memorizing. These are just a few of the ways in which we try and address issues of memory in these scales. Hard to work on or play with one thing for a long time unless it's really fun. Often butting in or interrupting others. Doing papers too fast, hard to slow down enough to be careful. Grabbing things or starting tasks without waiting for permission or directions. Or parents have to keep complaining about, I told you again and again and again, or too much teasing or arguing, even after being asked to quit it. Picking up obviously on some of the behavioral stuff here, but in the service of trying to understand executive function. So these are the general domains in which the Brown EFA scales are useful. And they're useful in several different ways. One is it can be a screener to identify individuals who really ought to be getting a full evaluation for ADHD. If you're working in a school or you're working in a clinic or even a general medical practice, if you've got somebody where you think, oh, this looks like it might be an ADHD problem, this is a good way to do a quick screening, which you can do in a matter of 10 or 15 minutes, and say, well, yeah, you probably ought to do it. I wouldn't try to diagnose on the basis of the score on this one scale or any other one scale. But if you use it with a clinical interview, you ought to be able to evaluate possible ADHD and get a pretty good idea of whether this is something, particularly when you compare it with the norms for that age group. And also related problems. It's not going to diagnose comorbid problems or co-occurring disorders, but there certainly are some items on that scale, if you look at it carefully, which can give you a hint that, hey, there's something else here we should be looking at in terms of, for example, excessive perfectionism that's slowing things down, or special difficulty with losing the temper. And then it also can be used as a tool for monitoring response to treatment. If you've got a treatment program going, you can repeat this measure and see how much difference there might be before or after. These are books I have published, which will give you a little more detail about the theory and sort of the practical facts about ADHD. The two most recent ones are Outside the Box and Smart But Stuck. But let me stop at this point. And also, I just want to call your attention to my website is here, brownadhdclinic.com, if you want to get more information about the model and get access to some papers that have been published and some of the videos. That's all available through my website. And of course, the Pearson website is going to have more information about these scales as well. So if you want to get some more information, here is the website, portion of the website for Pearson that will give you more details about the scales. And as I said, we're looking forward to having them out, we're expecting in December. But if you're interested in getting them, you might want to put your bid in sooner rather than later. So I'd be happy now to respond to any questions or comments that people would like to offer. I understand that some have been coming in to Chris online. And Chris, can you give me a lead on what you'd like me to address?
Sure thing, Dr. Brown. There was a question when you were discussing the executive function, the third one, regulating alertness, effort, and processing speed. The
Yes.
question was, would processing speed be better called visual motor speed? Sometimes people conflate that with mental speed, making it a problem to interpret in kids with low vision. They then think it belongs in the FSIQ, or the full-scale intelligence quota.
Yeah, I think that what I'm talking about with processing speed certainly includes some motor functions, but it's also a matter of how long does it take them to get it. You know, there's a book that Ellen Bratton at Harvard published about helping kids who are, let me look at the title, helping kids who can't keep up, where she does a pretty good discussion about the various ways of understanding processing speed. And what I pick up usually when I'm using these scales and talking with patients is how long does it take them to be able to write. You know, with younger kids, they're not expected to be able to do a lot of writing. But as you get older, you get some kids where it's, you know, you could talk about motor skills, but it's a matter of also being able to translate the ideas in your head into words on the page. And I think that whole area of processing speed, the questioner is right, and it picks up a wide range of things that I think we don't have very adequate assessment for being able to pick it up. But the fact is it includes not just motor speed, but also issues around being able to do that translation from thinking to actually putting words on a page.
Okay. Here's one more specific to the measure. Several people asked why a teacher form was not included for students ages 13 through 18?
I have used the ones for those adolescents in the regular form, but the fact is that most kids who are in high school, you're not going to get as much information because the teachers don't have them for that much time. And so usually what we depend on is information about, whatever parents' information can feed us about what the teachers have to say. Now, I realize there can be some advantages to getting direct feedback from teachers, and I certainly believe in querying about that. But I think it's also quite possible to do that with the forms that parents are filling out and ask the teachers to take a look at it and identify things. But also, I find sometimes if you just ask the teachers to give me a few sentences about this kid, I'm going to have more to work on.
All right. Then there was a question, any favorite treatment programs that correlate closely with your scales?
The scales are basically tools for assessing the executive function impairments, and they are not tied to any one particular treatment. Now, the most effective treatment for, the science demonstrates that the most effective treatment for ADHD is medication, and that works very well for some people, sort of well for others, and not at all for a smaller percentage. It works for about 8 out of 10 kids, and this has been these scales have been demonstrated to be helpful in the earlier version in marking progress for treatment. They've also been used in a number of clinical trials of medications and have proven effective there. But some of these things are also things which are used for remedial work by special education teachers and by tutors and by parents who are working closely with their kids to identify some of the problems that we can pick up on the scale and then translate that into, okay, what extra help does this kid need? So globally, it's not tied to just one particular program. There's some kids where they're going to be treated primarily with behavioral-oriented programs, and others are going to be treated with medications, and some are going to need some cognitive behavioral therapy or some psychotherapy or family therapy. And whatever the mode of treatment might be, often it'll be several of those things where the resources are available. You still can make good use of a good, careful assessment of the range of difficulties that this particular person's having. It's what your targets are for treatment.
All right. And one that's kind of related to that, in that when you're talking about looking at different areas, like within special ed and things, is the person asked, is the scale just for attention deficit disorder, or can it be used with other executive functioning impairments?
The reason that we labeled it with that slant line as executive function and then the forward slash attention is that I think of those as comparable terms. Now, I realize not everybody does, but I think you can write an equation saying ADHD equals a developmental impairment of executive function. Others might disagree with that particular way of talking about it. And remember, developmental impairment is differentiated from impairment that is secondary to brain injury or something like that. But yes, the notion of attention here it's a broad umbrella, which incorporates and subsumes, for me, in the general field, I think, this wide range of cognitive functions. It's absolutely true that there are some people who would look at the word attention and think of it as mainly listening when somebody's talking to you or looking at the text when you're reading. But the way I'm using it here is not with the term, we use the term focus. think about it more as like focus on your driving. It's not like when you're driving, you're staring at the bumper of the car in front of you. You're looking at what's going on there, but you're also looking down the street at the stoplight that's turning, and you have to get your foot off the accelerator and move it toward the brake as you've got to slow down and stop. You're also noticing what's coming up and behind you in your rear view mirrors and your side view mirrors. You also may be noticing that a truck is backing out of a driveway, and you've got to watch out for that. Somebody's opening a car door right out in your lane. You've got to come and work around them. A few pedestrians are running across the street to catch the bus, and there's some interesting signs on the other side of the street. And so when we're focusing on our driving, we are not just staring ahead and looking at one set of stimuli. We're attending to a variety of stimuli and setting priorities in terms of which things do we keep looking at. We're holding some of them in memory while we're doing, not that we're going to remember everything when we finish driving to wherever we're going to, but unless it's exceptional. But the whole idea here is this integration of the ability to focus and then to ignore and to utilize working memory and then to prioritize quickly what you're doing. Keep in mind where you're headed. I think it's the model of focus on your driving is a much better model for the kind of attention that we're talking about here. Not simply narrow, focused attention, which would be sort of the cognitive equivalent of focusing a camera.
All right. Do you have time for one more? I think we have time for one more question.
Sure.
The question is do you recommend using gender-specific or combined norms? Dr. Barkley recommends using gender-specific, while Cecil Reynolds says to use combined. What are your thoughts?
That's why it's nice to have both of them available in this particular instrument. I think it depends a lot on, I'd like to look at both of them. And the reason is that there are some behavioral things that are, rather different, particularly at certain ages between boys and girls. But I think it's also true that most of this stuff is going to be pretty similar back and forth. And if there's something that's widely deviant on one side of that versus the other, that's something that would be interesting to find out why.
All right. I think we're at the, or no, we have a couple. Let's do one more question?
Sure. Let's go.
Okay. Is it truly ADHD as defined medically, or is it the frontal lobe being rewired by sensory impacts such as video games?
Okay, that's a complicated question, but the short version of it is that executive functions are not exclusively functions of the frontal lobe. The more recent neuroscience research has made it very clear that these functions are functions that involve the whole brain, and there are a lot of the problems have to do with connections from different regions, regional networks of the brain, and some of them are rapid transient formations. These are not sort of Morse code messages going across from one synapse to another, but rather cascades of neurons moving rapidly across various parts of the brain, and that's the amazing process. And so I think that it's important to be able to think about this in a way which looks at it as the amazing work of the brain that helps us do the stuff we have to do from day to day. And it's not simply one part of the brain that's doing it.
All right. I think that's all the time that we have.
Okay, I would like to say thank you to you and to Sherry and to all those who tuned in, and I hope that you'll be interested. We're planning to do a couple more of these webinars as we get a little further along in analyzing our data and getting things put together to prepare for publication. And I hope that you'll be interested in following that. But thank you very much for attending.